Good evening. Tonight we descend into a story that will challenge everything you think you know about Scarlet Fever. What follows is a journey through fear, survival devastation, and the fragile line between life and death. It begins in the suffocating stillness of a winter ward where the air hangs thick with breath that trembles on the edge of disappearing. Beneath dim, exhausted lamps, rows of cots hold children whose bodies blaze with a heat that feels almost unnatural. An internal fire rising from something older, more patient, more cunning than the world around them. Nurses move with the heaviness of people who have learned to measure hope in hours, not days, because every sunrise carries away another voice, another heartbeat, another small future slipping quietly out of reach. In one cot lies a girl of 7, her skin flushed in a burning red that seems to pulse like embers beneath the surface. Her breathing is shallow-strained, as though each breath travels through a throat scraped raw by invisible claws. Her tongue, swollen and bright, resembles a berry crushed under too much weight. She tries to speak, she tries to call for her mother, but only a muted rasp escapes a sound thin as paper tearing. Moments later, even that small sound fades, swallowed by the silence that defines this ward more than any fever ever could. For in this place, silence is the great signal. It is the moment every parent fears, the moment the child stops speaking. Elsewhere in the same building, a mother clutches the rail of her son's bed with knuckles drained of all color. She listens to the erratic rhythm of his breath, rising fast, falling hard as though chased by something she cannot see. His rash glows with a heat that seems to radiate into the very air around him. His fever is climbing. Every parent in this place has learned that a fever can climb like a storm quietly at first, then suddenly breaking through the body with a violence no one can outrun. The corridors smell of sweat vinegar and fear. There's little order left. Doctors push through crowds of desperate families, their coats stained with the day's failures, their pockets heavy with thermometers that tremble after every reading. There are not enough beds, not enough medicines, not enough explanations. Outside, carriages and carts line the street, each one carrying another child, whose voice has vanished into the same heavy silence. Scarlet fever has arrived in full force. The disease moves through homes, as if guided by instinct striking with precision. A child who laughed in the warmth of a kitchen one evening may be drowning in fever by the next morning. A household that once echoed with noise may fall utterly quiet within days. Doctors describe the fever as explosive, a heat that surges until the skin glows, the throat swells, and the mind drifts. The rash spreads like a red tide, tight, hot, relentless, beginning on the neck and coursing down the body like a burning map of suffering. And then almost cruelly there's the voice. Scarlet fever steals it without warning. Children try to call out, but their words crumble into silence. The quiet becomes unbearable. Across entire towns, parents gather outside clinics with eyes hollow from nights spent pressing cold cloths to burning skin. Hope flickers, dims, flares again briefly, then fades. Rumors spread quickly of new cases of entire schools closed overnight, of brothers carrying sisters who can no longer walk. Scarlet fever has its own momentum, its own tempo, its own hunger. No matter how many times doctors confront it, each fresh wave feels like the beginning of something worse. For those living through the deadliest eras, there's a moment of realization that returns again and again. This is no ordinary childhood illness. It is a force, a predator, a red tide capable of sweeping through cities with the same cold inevitability as winter. The height of fever, the tightening of breath, the burning rash, the sudden silence. These become the signature marks of a disease that has stalked humanity for centuries, shaping childhood in ways too often forgotten. But none of these parents, none of these overwhelmed doctors, none of these silent children know what history will later reveal. They are standing in the middle of a nightmare that began long before any of them were born. A nightmare rooted in ancient soil, whispered through eras of conflict carried on the breath of the infected, shaped by a pathogen that has waited patiently for humanity to grow crowded, connected and vulnerable enough for its rise. Where did this nightmare begin? There's an ancient hush at the root of this story, a silence older than the names we have given to sickness. Long before microscopes or germ theory chroniclers recorded a fever that painted the skin red and left children thin and trembling. Hippocratic fragments whisper of reddened bodies and burning fevers. A Sicilian anatomist in the 16th century named the malady rosalia and wrote of patients whose skin seemed on fire, and physicians across Europe began to separate this burning illness from other eruptions that looked similar yet behaved differently. These early pages show a species of human fear, not of monsters, but of contagion, that spread without intent, carried on breath and touch, indifferent and inevitable. The earliest words are ambiguous. For centuries, the disease lived in confusion with measles, smallpox, and other eruptive fevers. That confusion is not simply a historical accident. It is a mirror of the limits of observation before the microscope. Symptoms overlapped, rashes, high fevers, children who shrank from the light. Yet some features stood out: a sandpaper rash, a bright swollen tongue, a throat that closed and choked. Physicians began to mark those differences with anxious precision, because those differences mattered. They separated fleeting eruptions from something that could decide which families would survive and which would be hollowed by loss. In the minds of early healers, the question was elemental. Where did this red fire come from? Natural philosophers and country doctors proposed routes that blended observation with myth. Some blamed imbalances of humors, celestial alignments, miasmas rising from marshes. Others suspected contagion carried on clothing and breath. The language used in old treatises betrays both awe and helplessness, an attempt to catalog symptoms while groping for causes they could not see. The disease was as much a problem of explanation as it was of bodies to name. It was the first step toward controlling it. Scholars like Giovanni Filippo Ingrassia made careful distinctions, arguing that the fever they saw was distinct from measles and smallpox, and in doing so, they quietly laid the groundwork for centuries of clinical observation. Biology, however, would wait. For centuries, the invisible agents that moved within throat and blood could only be imagined. The real origins of scarlet fever, the bacterium we now call Streptococcus pyogenes, and the toxins some of its strains produce remain unknowable until the advent of bacteriology and the careful, often lonely work of late 19th and early 20th century scientists. It took microscopes, culture plates, and the patient isolation of organisms to pull the mask off this ancient foe. When scientists finally identified strains of Group A Streptococcus as the culprit and traced the role of pyrogenic exotoxins in producing the distinctive rash and systemic shock, the story shifted from myth to mechanism. The red flood that had terrorized generations was shown to be the product of a tiny organism and its biochemical weaponry. Yet even with identification came new questions. Where did the bacterium itself come from? Could animals harbor it? The evidence points to humans as the principal reservoir for the strains that cause classic scarlet fever. But Streptococci are ancient companions of many species. Relatives of the bacterium live widely in nature. The jump from harmless carriage to toxin-producing catastrophe often reflects both microbial change and human circumstance. Crowding, poor sanitation, war, and trade created ecological niches in which particular strains could flourish, and when they acquired phage-encoded toxins, ignite into epidemic outbreaks. In this way, the biological origins of scarlet fever are braided tightly to human history. The microbe exists on its own terms, but its devastation is written in the architecture of human communities. Medical discovery unfolded slowly and painfully. In the 17th and 18th centuries, physicians cataloged clinical patterns: fever followed by rash, the swelling and roughness of skin-swollen glands, and the distinctive strawberry tongue, a bright, bumpy tongue that seemed to announce the disease's arrival. These observations would prove crucial. They shaped surveillance, guided quarantines, and provided the descriptive language through which later bacteriologists would map symptom to cause. Clinical observation was the scaffolding on which later laboratory breakthroughs would hang. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, the illness moved quietly, and then with terrible force surfacing in episodic outbreaks that left entire neighborhoods bereft. The disease's apparent caprice, striking wildly in some years and receding in others, masked underlying dynamics. We are only beginning to appreciate genetic shifts in the bacterium, the movement of mobile genetic elements that carry toxin genes, and the invisible hand of social change cities, densifying children gathered in schools, armies on the move. Each change in human behavior altered the microbe's stage. Each new trade route, military campaign, or crowded harbor was a new avenue for spread. The origins of scarlet fever are therefore neither only biological nor only social. They are an intersection, an ongoing coevolution between pathogen and people. And so the story of origins resists simple closure. There's no single birthplace, no neat origin point written in a single chronicle. Instead, there are layers of emergence, clinical recognition, in early modern Europe, microbial identification, in the age of bacteriology, and repeated ecological awakenings across centuries. The disease's deep time is a palimpsest of human responses: name, observation, fear, and eventually scientific attack. Each of those layers changes how humanity perceives itself and its vulnerability to the microscopic life that shares our world. If origins are diffuse, they are no less ominous. To understand where the nightmare began is also to confront how human societies created the conditions for its most devastating forms. The pathogen existed before cities crowded, but the scale of its havoc is a story of our making: the densification of childhood, the institutionalization of care, the mixing of populations in ports and battlefields. The red fever's history is a mirror in which the architecture of human life is reflected back as possibility for thriving, and possibility for collapse. Where the nightmare began, then, is not a single place. It is a continuous unfolding and interplay of microbe and milieus. The accounts of those early physicians, the discovery of streptococcal toxins, the genetic lessons of the bacteriophage, all of these pieces together tell us that scarlet fever's origins are as much about human movement and social structure as they are about microbial mutation. An understanding that braided origin is the first reluctant step toward understanding how such a disease could haunt childhood for centuries. The rise of scarlet fever did not occur in a single burst of terror, but in waves that followed the great movements of humanity itself. As towns swelled into cities, as families pressed together in tight rooms, as empires expanded along ancient roads and across wide oceans, the unseen enemy found new corridors through which to move. Scarlet fever traveled quietly at first, carried in the breaths of children who appeared healthy one day and burning the next. It hid in crowded markets, in the narrow halls of schools, in the close quarters of ships where travelers slept side by side. Every point of human contact became an opening. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the disease expanded with a momentum that mirrored the growth of trade. Ports that bustled with merchants and laborers became crossroads of contagion. Dock workers unloading cargo inhaled air shared by sailors who had just endured storms and cramped decks, and within days the red fever would take root in neighborhoods already strained by poverty and filth. The disease moved with the logic of opportunity. Wherever people gathered, it followed. Armies too carried it. Soldiers lived pressed together in barracks, marched through ruined towns, camped in makeshift shelters, where illness spread faster than commands. Scarlet fever accompanied campaigns like an invisible battalion, weakening ranks, silencing young voices long before battlefields ever did. As troops moved villages along their routes, suffered sudden outbreaks that seemed to rise from nowhere, each one a reminder of how war reshapes not just borders, but bodies. Inside the growing cities of Europe, the expansion was even more relentless. Narrow streets filled with refuse water systems, tainted by human waste homes, built tightly around courtyards where sunlight rarely touched the ground. All these places became fertile ground. Children played in alleys where bacteria could linger in dust and droplets. Schools, once symbols of progress, became engines of transmission. A single infected child could set off a chain of illness that swept through classrooms, households, and entire districts within weeks. Doctors recognized the pattern, but could do little to interrupt it. They recorded eruptions with mounting dread, sudden spikes of fever rashes, spreading with terrifying uniformity. Neighborhoods emptied of laughter. Hospitals overflowed. Beds were pushed so close together that the sick breathed into the air of the dying. The disease seemed to thrive on the very structure of human life, turning every gathering place into a battlefield no one realized they were standing on. By the early 19th century, scarlet fever had become one of the most feared diseases of childhood across Europe and beyond. As migrants crossed oceans seeking new lives, the pathogen traveled with them. Ships carried families tightly packed below deck, where fresh air was scarce and illness had room to grow. When newcomers arrived in North America, Australia, or the Caribbean, they brought both hope and the bacterium that had already carved sorrow into so many homelands. New settlements, still fragile and unprepared, faced waves of fever that swept through communities before defenses could be built. And through all this movement, something else was happening, something quieter, more insidious. The pathogen itself was changing. Mutations emerged, weaving new traits into its genetic fabric. Some strains became more violent, igniting rashes that spread faster, fevers that burned, higher complications that tore through the body with alarming speed. Outbreaks grew deadlier. A city might endure one wave only to be struck harder the next season, as though each passing year sharpened the microbe's instinct for survival. Parents lived under the shadow of unpredictability. A mild season could be followed by a devastating one. A neighborhood untouched for years might suddenly become an epicenter. There was no pattern that anyone could rely on. The uncertainty became its own form of suffering, a tension that lingered in every household where children slept lightly and mothers listened for the smallest change in breath. As scarlet fever spread across continents, it left deep scars not just on bodies but on societies. Schools closed abruptly, leaving children without guidance or refuge. Orphanages overflowed with those who had survived the fever, only to lose the hands that once cared for them. Burial grounds expanded, and in some cities new cemeteries were established solely to contain the growing number of small coffins that arrived week after week. Governments attempted to respond, but their efforts were fragmented and inconsistent. Notices were posted warning families to isolate the sick, but isolation was a luxury many could not afford. In working districts, families lived several to a room. A single cough could touch everyone by morning. Fear spread as rapidly as the disease itself. Fear of breath, of proximity, of the sudden flush on a child's cheek. Scarlet fever, once a scattered affliction, had become a global force. It moved with caravans and ships, with soldiers and traders, with families seeking better lives. It followed the arteries of empire and the veins of commerce. Everywhere humanity expanded, the disease found new ground to claim. And as the world entered the industrial age, louder, faster, denser, scarlet fever rose to meet it with a violence that would define the era to come. As the 19th century accelerated into its industrial roar, scarlet fever became an unwelcome reflection of progress, a reminder that beneath every new factory, every swelling tenement, every freshly laid railway, there existed a hidden infrastructure of vulnerability. The disease did not merely follow humanity's expansion, it exploited it. Cities pulsed with new life, but that same pulse carried microbes through streets where thousands now breathed the same air, touched the same railings, drank from the same contaminated sources. Factories drew families from rural villages into tight urban quarters where privation settled like dust on every surface. Children labored in mills, breathing fibers that irritated their throats, weakening the very tissues the bacterium sought. It was in these dim, crowded rooms that scarlet fever found its most fertile hosts. Young, exhausted, undernourished bodies that could not mount the defenses needed to resist a pathogen sharpened by centuries of adaptation. And while physicians recorded each outbreak with mounting alarm, their warnings rarely carried beyond the hospital walls. Factories needed labor, cities needed growth. Public health was a distant concept. Illness was viewed as unfortunate but inevitable, a tax paid by the poor to keep the engines of progress turning. Scarlet fever took advantage of every omission. In neighborhoods where refuse filled the gutters and water pumps drew from lines contaminated by sewage, the disease surged with terrible efficiency. Rooms where families slept six to a bed became chambers of transmission. A single infected throat could turn an entire building into a hive of fever within days. The disease moved invisibly, silently, seizing opportunity wherever it found it. Then came one of the darkest truths. Scarlet fever struck hardest where children were most concentrated: schools, orphanages, boarding houses. Institutions founded to protect childhood instead became crucibles of infection. Teachers watched as entire classrooms fell sick within a week. In some districts, attendance charts became grim maps of sequential disappearance. One child after another, marked absent, their desks left empty as the fever claimed more voices. Reports from Europe describe outbreaks that rippled across cities with terrifying uniformity. Vienna, London, Glasgow, Copenhagen each endured waves that left thousands of graves in their wake. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, hanging damp cloths over doorways, hoping to filter the air of something too small to see. Mothers kept vigil beside feverish children, feeding them broth that went untouched and wiping away sweat that returned moments after it was cleared. What made scarlet fever particularly cruel was its speed. Within hours, a child could shift from playful to perilously ill. Doctors spoke of cases where the fever rose so quickly that delirium set in before anyone realized the danger. The red rash, coarse and hot, spread down the body like a tide of embers. Glands swelled, breath tightened, and then with unnerving suddenness, the child's voice began to strain, first hoarse, then faint, then gone. In many households the moment silence replaced speech, marked the pivot from fear to despair. Communities turned to any remedy they could imagine: mustard plasters, vinegar washes, herbal mixtures passed down through generations. Some of these rituals brought comfort, few brought recovery. The truth unknown at the time was that the illness was shaped not only by the microbe, but by the toxins it carried, toxins capable of igniting inflammation throughout the body. No poultice could stop them. As global trade expanded even further, the disease crossed borders and oceans with an inevitability that made it feel almost alive. If a ship carried textiles, spices, tea, or grain, it might also carry a passenger who would begin coughing 2 days before landfall. In a port city already struggling with cholera or typhus, one new pathogen slipping ashore was enough to set another grim chapter in motion. By the mid-19th century, territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas recorded rising numbers of childhood deaths that followed the same unmistakable pattern: fever rash, sore throat, swollen tongue, and the haunting quiet that descended after a child tried to speak and found no sound waiting. Scarlet fever was no longer a regional terror. It had become a planetary one. Societies responded unevenly. Wealthier families fled crowded cities for the countryside during outbreaks, believing fresh air could shield them. Poorer families had no such refuge. Their homes became sealed chambers of risk. Some governments attempted basic quarantines, closing schools, warning parents, isolating the sick, but without understanding the organism behind the disease. These efforts were fragile, inconsistent, often too late. Newspapers printed obituary lists that stretched for pages. Churches held funerals daily. Graveyards expanded into fields once used for livestock. Entire communities lived in a haze of dread, waiting for the slightest cough to announce another round of loss. It was during this era that scarlet fever achieved its most fearsome reputation, the silent destroyer of childhood. Parents feared it more than smallpox in certain regions, more than cholera, more than influenza. Because scarlet fever did not merely kill it, stole voices, altered hearts, damaged kidneys, transformed the bodies of survivors long after the fever cooled. The global rise of this disease was not only a movement through space, but a movement through the architecture of human life itself. It revealed how interconnected the world had become, how fragile systems were in the face of microscopic predators. And it foreshadowed a new age, an age where sickness could travel faster than understanding, where the growth of civilization carried with it the seeds of epidemic devastation. By the dawn of the 20th century, scarlet fever had spread to every continent where children gathered in numbers, leaving a trail of loss carved into cities and villages alike. The stage was set for its next transformation, one that would lead to some of the deadliest childhood epidemics ever recorded. There are periods in human history when a single disease gains such power over the imagination that it reshapes the emotional landscape of entire societies. For scarlet fever, that period was the 18th and 19th centuries, an age when the red rash became a specter haunting every home, every school, every quiet bedroom where a child coughed in the night. This was the era when scarlet fever stepped across the threshold from illness to terror. It began with the suddenness of its arrival. A child might wake with only a sore throat, nothing more than a faint irritation that any parent might dismiss. But by afternoon, the fever surged upward with a violence that felt almost unnatural. Skin flushed red, the pulse sprinted, and a heat radiated outward as though the body had been set alight from within. By evening, the rash bloomed tiny points at first, then spreading into a rough, blazing sheet that covered the torso and limbs. Mothers described it as though the skin itself were burning. Fathers helpless stood by as their children's voices thinned and disappeared. And then came the quiet. Families spoke of it as the worst part. The moment when a child opened their mouth to call for comfort and nothing emerged but a cracked whisper. The moment the fever stole sound itself. Across Europe and North America, scarlet fever surged in waves that seemed to grow more savage with each passing decade. Cities recorded outbreaks that left thousands dead, mostly children under 10. Entire families could be struck down in a single week. In some households, multiple siblings lay side by side, their fevers rising in unison, as parents tried desperately to cool them with water, drawn from pumps that were themselves contaminated. Hospitals already strained by cholera and typhoid became overwhelmed. Wards filled with small bodies glowing red with fever. Beds were arranged so closely that nurses could barely squeeze between them. Doctors moved from cot to cot with trembling hands, carrying notebooks stained by sweat and ink, writing down symptoms they could not stop. They saw the same signs again and again: the swollen glands, the sandpaper rash, the exhausted hearts that struggled to keep pace with the fever's demands. In some regions, mortality climbed so high that communities turned to mass burials. Coffins were arranged in rows, sometimes so small that they could be carried two at a time. Clergy led prayers spoken through choked voices as parents stood in clusters, their grief blending into a single suffocating weight. The fear that followed was unlike anything previous generations had known. Scarlet fever hid in plain sight. It did not come with the unmistakable pustules of smallpox or the violent vomiting of cholera. Its earliest signs were ordinary: a sore throat, a mild fever, a child too tired to play. Parents became hypervigilant, listening through the night for the slightest shift in breath. Stories circulated of children who went to bed with only a mild illness and never woke again. Superstition flourished in the vacuum of understanding. Some communities blamed contaminated milk. Others whispered of cursed spirits or poisoned air drifting through certain neighborhoods. In rural villages, wells were abandoned in favor of distant streams believed to be untouched by the disease. In cities, families burned herbs, kept animals away from sick rooms, or scrubbed walls with urine and vinegar, in the hope that some old ritual might hold back the red tide. Doctors lacking the tools of modern medicine argued bitterly among themselves. Some insisted the disease spread through foul air. Others believed it passed from person to person by touch. Still others claimed it emerged spontaneously in dirty environments. These disagreements fractured medical institutions and left families trapped between conflicting advice. One physician advised strict isolation, another insisted fresh air was essential. A third argued that isolation would only doom a child by cutting them off from warmth and comfort. Political leaders overwhelmed by cholera, famine, and industrial unrest often faltered. Some ignored outbreaks altogether, fearing economic backlash if factories and schools were closed. Others issued decrees too late, ordering quarantines after the fever had already devoured entire districts. Public notices were plastered on walls, warning families to keep sick children indoors, but enforcement varied wildly. In poorer neighborhoods, quarantine was impossible. 6 people shared a single room. If one became sick, all would breathe the same air before the night was through. Teachers watched classrooms empty day by day. A single week could transform a lively room of children into a silent space lined with vacant desks. Some schools closed entirely their windows, shuttered their halls, left to gather dust until officials deemed the danger had passed. In the worst years, city streets felt eerily quiet as parents kept children indoors for months at a time. The epidemic waves were not isolated. They came repeatedly, often with increasing ferocity. Communities barely recovered from one outbreak before another descended. And each wave seemed to carry strains more aggressive than the last strains that caused deeper organ damage, more severe fevers, more deaths. The disease had no mercy, no rhythm, no predictable cycle. It chose its moments with terrifying indifference. By the late 19th century, scarlet fever had become one of the leading killers of children in industrialized nations. It shaped childhood itself, turning every sore throat into a moment of dread. Parents learned to examine tongues, searching for the bright redness that signaled danger. They felt their children's skin with trembling hands, hoping the rough texture they feared would not emerge. And in many homes, the faintest blush of fever was enough to plunge entire families into fear. This was the age of terror, an era defined not only by the scale of death, but by the psychological burden it imposed. Scarlet fever became a constant, inescapable presence, haunting kitchens, nurseries, and schoolyards. It rewrote the emotional vocabulary of parenthood, teaching mothers and fathers to live with a quiet, persistent fear that hovered over every breath their children took. And just when communities believed the worst had passed, the disease would return with renewed strength, as if reminding humanity that understanding alone could not tame it, that survival depended not only on science, but on the fragile conditions of the world itself. As the 19th century deepened, scarlet fever evolved from a periodic torment into a defining force that shaped public life in ways both visible and unseen. In city after city, the disease carved pathways of grief that ran parallel to the new boulevards and smokestacks rising toward the polluted sky. Even in quiet rural towns, places once thought sheltered by distance and clean air, the fever arrived like a silent wind. A single traveler could bring it. A single school term could ignite it. A single winter could turn an entire valley into a place of mourning. In many regions, children lived with the knowledge that illness could strike without warning. They learned to interpret the tension in their parents' faces each time a sibling coughed. They felt the sudden quiet that fell over a room when a fever rose too high. Childhood became a fragile privilege, shadowed by a disease that seemed to erase futures before they had time to form. Doctors continued their desperate attempts to document the illness with precision. They recorded pulse rates, rash patterns, the progression of swelling in the throat, the color changes in the tongue. Their notes read like battlefield journals, cold clinical accounts of a relentless enemy advancing through small, vulnerable bodies. Some physicians traveled from house to house, moving through neighborhoods where the sick lay in rows on makeshift bedding, their flushed skin illuminated by candlelight that flickered in rooms too damp and overcrowded to offer comfort. What made scarlet fever particularly horrifying was the sudden shift it could impose. A child who appeared to be recovering could deteriorate in hours, consumed by complications no one understood. Hearts weakened, kidneys failed. Fever spiraled until delirium set in, and tiny hands clawed at bed linens as though searching for a way back to clarity. In many cases, death came not from the fever itself, but from the cascade of internal damage left in its wake. Families learned to fear not only the illness, but the lingering shadow it cast. Even a child who survived the initial wave could be left with scarred hearts or chronic weakness that lasted a lifetime. Superstition tightened its grip as medical certainty faltered. In some villages, families hung charms near doorways believing they could repel the invisible threat. Others burned straw in courtyards, hoping the acrid smoke would purify the air. Some communities feared that cats or dogs could spread the illness and drove them from homes, leaving villages eerily silent, except for the persistent echo of coughs behind shuttered windows. Every new outbreak produced new theories, none of them fully trusted, but all of them grasped at in desperation by families who felt abandoned by the limits of medical knowledge. Governments struggled to respond with coherence. In some places, public notices were distributed, instructing parents to isolate sick children, but without understanding how the disease truly spread, these measures often did little. Isolation required space most families did not have. Many households lived in single rooms, their inhabitants packed so tightly that separating the sick from the healthy was impossible. Some cities attempted to enforce temporary school closures, only to reopen buildings weeks later when political pressure demanded it, triggering yet another round of devastation. Fear became a social force. It dictated daily routines. It governed the movement of people through crowded markets. It lingered in the hesitation of a mother before allowing her child to join others in a courtyard. It shaped decisions made by leaders and physicians, often pushing communities toward panic or paralysis. Entire neighborhoods experienced waves of illness that left visible scars. Streets once filled with children's games fell silent. Curtains remained drawn for months. Families marked windows with black fabric to signal mourning. Funerals became so frequent in some towns that bells tolled until their ropes frayed and needed replacement. Clergy delivered sermons to congregations hollowed by loss, their voices echoing in sanctuaries where the absence of small footsteps carried a weight that no scripture could soothe. The disease also reshaped the identity of the medical profession. Young doctors learned that scarlet fever was not only a clinical challenge, but a personal trial, one that demanded emotional resilience in the face of daily tragedy. Some physicians withdrew from practice, entirely unable to continue watching families unravel. Others doubled their efforts, driven by a sense of moral duty that bordered on obsession. They dissected the bodies of children in dim, cold rooms, searching for patterns in damaged tissues, hoping that understanding the disease's path through the body might one day illuminate a path to resistance. But in this period, hope remained elusive. Scarlet fever seemed to defy consistency. An outbreak in one city might cause mild illness, while a similar wave in another region led to widespread death. Communities waited for explanations that never arrived. The randomness of severity, its uneven cruelty, became one of the disease's most feared qualities. By the end of the 19th century, scarlet fever stood beside smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis as one of the most dreaded afflictions of the age. And yet, unlike smallpox, it lacked a clear external marker that the world could rally against. The rash faded, the throat healed, survivors carried invisible wounds, and the microbe lingered quietly in the population waiting for another chance to surge. This more than anything defined the age of terror, the sense that the enemy was both everywhere and nowhere. Scarlet fever did not require a crisis to reappear. It dwelled in the ordinary rhythms of life, hidden in the breath of the healthy, woven into the interactions of children, sharing toys, families, sharing meals, communities, sharing spaces. It was not simply a disease of the body, it was a disease of the atmosphere itself, an ever-present reminder that beneath the progress and pride of the industrial world, humanity remained vulnerable to forces it could neither see nor predict. And in this tension between progress and peril, hope and devastation, the story of scarlet fever entered its most revealing chapter, the struggle to understand how the enemy worked from within. To understand scarlet fever is to step into a world too small for the naked eye, a realm where the architecture of illness is built from cells, toxins, and the calculated strategies of a microbe that learned long ago how to survive inside the human throat. This chapter is not about fear alone, but about mechanism, about the quiet, intimate violence unfolding beneath the skin of every infected child. At the center of the disease lies Streptococcus pyogenes, a bacterium delicate in appearance but ruthless in behavior. Its structure is deceptively simple, spherical cells chained together like tiny beads, but that simplicity masks a mastery of survival that has evolved across centuries. It enters the human body through the soft corridors of the throat, slipping past the defenses of the mouth and anchoring itself to the warm, moist tissues where breath and voice are born. Once attached, the bacterium begins its work with unsettling precision. It releases enzymes that soften the boundaries of cells, creating pathways into deeper layers of tissue. It divides rapidly each new generation, expanding the bacterial colony, as though laying siege to the very architecture of the throat. The immune system rushes to contain the invader, and in that collision microbe against defense, the fever sparks its first flame. The heat rises, the throat swells, pain expands like a tightening fist. But scarlet fever is not defined by infection alone. It is defined by something more insidious, the toxins. Some strains of Streptococcus pyogenes carry within them the genetic instructions for erythrogenic toxins molecules that act like chemical firebrands. Once released into the bloodstream, these toxins ignite inflammation throughout the body, sending signals that cause blood vessels near the skin's surface to widen and leak. The result is the infamous rash, a red, sandpaper-like eruption that spreads over the torso and limbs, as though the skin itself were reacting to an invisible burn. The rash is not a surface irritation. It is a systemic event, an outward sign of an inward storm. The toxins do more than inflame, they distort the immune response, pushing it into overdrive. Lymph nodes swell with the force of a system struggling to control the spread. The tongue, rich with blood vessels and sensitive tissue, swells and reddens until its surface rises into small, bright bumps. Physicians came to call this the strawberry tongue, a detail that became one of the clearest markers of the disease's presence. Deep within the throat, the same toxins trigger swelling that restricts airways and steals sound. The cords that produce speech become inflamed and strained, struggling to vibrate. Children try to speak, but their voices crack, fade, and finally vanish into breath alone. This loss of voice became the haunting signature of scarlet fever, an early warning that the disease had moved beyond a simple infection and into a full-body assault. Inside the bloodstream, another battle unfolds. White blood cells attack the bacteria with relentless force, but each wave of immune activity also fuels the fever. Heat surges as the body attempts to create an environment inhospitable to the invader. For the child, this heat feels like a fire rising behind the eyes, spreading down the neck into the chest, pulsing outward with every heartbeat. The heart itself becomes strained by the effort. It races to push blood through swollen tissues to deliver oxygen where inflammation has tightened the passageways. In severe cases, the toxins and the immune response weaken the valves, leaving behind scars that will shape the body long after recovery. Many who survive scarlet fever in past centuries carried these silent injuries throughout adulthood damage that revealed itself only years later in persistent fatigue or sudden cardiac failure. Meanwhile, the kidneys work desperately to filter toxins and inflammatory debris from the blood. In some children, this burden becomes too great. The filters clog, fluid accumulates, swelling appears in the face and legs, a condition known now as post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis emerges a delayed echo of the battle fought earlier in the throat. This is the hidden cruelty of scarlet fever. Even when the fever breaks and the rash fades, the internal wounds may continue to unfold. And still the bacterium persists with a quiet cunning. It hides within the folds of the throat, surviving on the very surfaces meant to guard the body. It can linger for weeks in a host who appears otherwise healthy, waiting for an opportunity to spread through a cough, a shared cup, a moment of close breath between children. The incubation period is short. Typically 2 to 4 days after exposure, the first signs appear: sore, throat headache, nausea, a rising heat that signals the immune system's awakening. By the time the rash emerges, the battle inside the body is already underway, and the toxins have begun their work in the bloodstream. Why children? Why them more than adults? Part of the answer lies in immunity. Adults exposed over time often develop partial protection antibodies that recognize certain streptococcal toxins. But children, especially young ones, whose immune systems have not yet encountered these bacterial strains, stand defenseless before the full force of the toxin's assault. Their bodies learn too late. Their tissues react too strongly. Their immune response becomes both weapon and wound. In the centuries before antibiotics, survival depended on a delicate balance, whether the child's immune system could outpace the bacterium's advance, whether the fever could burn without consuming vital organs, whether swelling in the throat would subside before it prevented breath. There were no medicines capable of stopping the organism's replication, no scientific tools to track its spread. Each child faced the illness alone, their body forced to resolve a microscopic war with nothing but its own resilience. This microscopic struggle, hidden beneath skin and silence, shaped the course of human history. The rash, the fever, the stolen voices, all were manifestations of a tiny organism waging a calculated invasion, using the body's own defenses to amplify its effects. Scarlet fever was not merely a disease. It was a strategy, one refined by evolution, executed through toxins, and sustained by the vulnerabilities of childhood itself. And yet, even as this microscopic enemy tightened its grip, humanity began preparing its counterattack, one forged in quarantine wards, laboratories, political chambers, and the desperate corridors of war. The deeper one looks into the mechanics of scarlet fever, the clearer it becomes that the disease is not a single event, but a sequence, an unfolding chain of biological maneuvers, each building upon the last. The bacterium begins with entry, continues with invasion, and culminates in a disruption so profound that entire systems within the body are forced into crisis. It is within this chain that the true architecture of the disease reveals itself. Inside the tonsils and soft tissues of the throat, Streptococcus pyogenes forms colonies that behave like organized outposts. The organism produces proteins that mimic human molecules, confusing the immune system and delaying recognition. This mimicry is one of its most effective tools, an evolutionary disguise that allows the bacterium precious time to strengthen its foothold before the body understands the threat. When the immune system finally mounts its response, the confrontation is explosive. White blood cells flood the infected tissues, releasing waves of inflammatory chemicals designed to kill invaders. But the streptococcal toxins amplify this reaction, turning the immune system's firepower against the body it was meant to protect. Capillaries dilate, fluids leak, heat intensifies. The throat becomes a battlefield swollen with inflammation and filled with debris from dying cells and bacteria. In the bloodstream, the toxins travel farther, sparking reactions throughout the body. Skin richly supplied with tiny vessels becomes one of the earliest visible sites of this systemic inflammation. The rash that defines scarlet fever arises as countless capillaries widen and bleed small amounts of fluid into the surrounding layers. Under the fingertips, the surface feels dry and rough, a texture physicians later described as sandpaper-like, though the sensation for the afflicted child is more like a persistent irritation that spreads with the fever's rhythm. The face often flushes first, though the area around the mouth remains pale, a chilling contrast known historically as circumoral pallor, a sign that told physicians they were facing something far more serious than a common childhood illness. The redness then flows downward across the body, a tide of inflammation that mirrors the toxin's movement through the circulatory system. But the rash is only one layer of the disease. Beneath it, the toxins infiltrate deeper structures. The lymph nodes swell with the burden of processing damaged cells and bacterial fragments. The spleen, one of the body's filtration centers, becomes enlarged as it strains to manage the onslaught. The liver increases its output of acute phase proteins, flooding the body with molecules meant to neutralize toxins, but often contributing to the child's overwhelming sense of malaise. At the center of all this turmoil lies the fever, a weapon both protective and perilous. The brain's temperature-regulating center, triggered by immune signals, raises the body's heat in an attempt to hinder the bacteria's growth. But in children whose temperature control systems are more easily disrupted, this fever can spiral rapidly. As heat climbs, metabolism accelerates. The heart pumps faster. The child breathes more quickly, drawing in air that offers little relief to a throat already raw with inflammation. If the infection spreads deeper, complications emerge. The bacterium can infiltrate the middle ear, causing acute pain and potential hearing loss. It may spread to the sinuses or down the respiratory tract, provoking pneumonia and weakened lungs. In some cases, the toxins trigger overwhelming immune reactions that lead to shock, blood pressure drops, consciousness dims, and the child slips dangerously close to collapse. The immune system's memory of this battle becomes a double-edged legacy. After recovery, many children develop antibodies that protect them from specific streptococcal toxins, reducing the likelihood of future scarlet fever. Yet this same immune vigilance can sometimes turn inward. Certain streptococcal proteins resemble human tissues, and when the immune system attacks them, it may also attack the body's own cells. This is the shadow behind rheumatic fever, a complication in which the heart joints and nervous system become targets of mistaken identity, leaving lifelong scars on survivors of what seemed at first to be an ordinary infection. Recovery from scarlet fever, when it comes, unfolds in stages. As the fever recedes and the rash fades, the skin begins to peel, a shedding of the outermost layers that can continue for weeks. This peeling, sometimes gentle, sometimes dramatic, is the body's final act of renewal, replacing the tissue most affected by toxin-induced inflammation. For parents in past centuries, the sight of peeling skin was bittersweet, a sign that their child had survived, but also a reminder of how close they had come to losing them. What lingered after recovery was not always visible. Some children carried heart murmurs, reminders of valves weakened by inflammation. Others developed kidney problems weeks after the infection appeared to resolve. These delayed consequences baffled physicians for generations, deepening the aura of dread surrounding the disease. Scarlet fever was never just an acute illness. It was a pathogen that left echoes imprinting its passage on the body long after the fever cooled. Throughout history, families learned to fear these echoes. Even when a child smiled again, even when their appetite returned, parents watched closely for signs that something deeper had been damaged. They listened to their child's breathing at night, anxious for irregularities. They examined urine for discoloration. They hoped the heart had been spared. This interplay, the fierce war within the body, the toxins' assault, the immune system's struggle, the long tail of complications formed the true legacy of scarlet fever before the age of modern medicine. It was a disease that acted with speed, subtlety, and a kind of biological intelligence shaped by evolutionary pressure. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, humanity began to push back with its own evolving arsenal. Laboratories multiplied, quarantine systems solidified, new scientific rivalries took shape. Wars created both chaos and breakthroughs. The next chapter would not be defined merely by the microbe's strategies, but by humanity's attempt to counter them, sometimes with brilliance, sometimes with failures that carried their own cost. As the 20th century began to rise out of the shadows of the 19th, humanity entered a new phase in its struggle against scarlet fever. Cities had grown larger, denser, louder. Scientific laboratories flickered with lamplight deep into the night. Nations prepared for wars that would redraw borders and reorder societies. Yet beneath all this change, the old fear persisted, the fear carried by mothers who pressed a hand to their child's forehead and felt the unmistakable heat returning. The red fever had not loosened its grip. It had only changed the world in which it moved. The first years of the century brought new attempts at control. Public health officials, armed with evolving theories of contagion, introduced measures once unthinkable. Schools began mandatory examinations. Children with the faintest symptoms, sore throat, flushed cheeks, a single swollen lymph node were sent home with slips of paper instructing families to isolate them immediately. Inspectors walked door to door, marking homes where illness was suspected. Curtains drawn throughout the day became the silent symbols of quarantines imposed by fear as much as by law. Yet quarantine was never simple. In wealthier districts, families had space to separate the sick from the healthy. In working-class neighborhoods where several people shared a single narrow room, isolation was a myth. Scarlet fever spread between siblings sleeping shoulder to shoulder between families, sharing water pumps between children who played in alleys because there was nowhere else to go. Public health measures were strongest on paper and weakest where they were needed most. The disease also became entangled in politics. During years of heavy outbreaks, officials debated how much truth to release to the public. Some cities downplayed the severity of epidemics to avoid economic decline, insisting that only a handful of cases existed, even as hospitals overflowed. Newspapers received warnings not to incite unnecessary panic, a phrase that often meant disguising the very information families needed to survive. In some regions, doctors were pressured to classify scarlet fever deaths under more generic terms to keep statistics from rising too sharply. War made everything worse. When the First World War erupted, millions of soldiers lived in cramped trenches, barracks, and transport ships, perfect environments for the spread of streptococcal infections. Though scarlet fever was less common among adults, the close quarters allowed strains of Streptococcus pyogenes to circulate widely, evolve rapidly, and return home with soldiers who brought the bacteria back to their families. In military hospitals, doctors saw wound infections caused by aggressive streptococcal strains, some of which carried toxins resembling those found in scarlet fever. The lines between battlefield wounds and childhood epidemics began to blur. Civilians suffered in parallel. Wartime shortages meant overcrowded hospitals, limited medical supplies, and malnutrition in many communities. Weak bodies were easier prey. Children deprived of nutritious diets or adequate heat during winter months became especially vulnerable. Even in households untouched by direct violence, the echo of war deepened the disease's toll, but conflict also accelerated scientific ambition. As nations funneled resources into understanding infection, control laboratories expanded their research. Scientists studied streptococcal strains with renewed urgency, mapping their surface proteins, tracing the behavior of their toxins, and experimenting with early antiserums designed to neutralize the bacteria's most destructive molecules. Some treatments showed promise. Others produced reactions as dangerous as the disease itself. The search for certainty grew frantic. In certain hospitals, experimental approaches bordered on desperate. Physicians attempted transfusions from recovered patients to the newly ill, hoping that antibodies might provide a shield against the toxins. A few children improved. Others worsened, dramatically, their bodies unable to weather the abrupt introduction of foreign blood. Every success was shadowed by failures that weighed heavily on the minds of the medical staff who recorded them. Throughout this period, blame swirled through society. Milk sellers were accused of spreading the disease. Immigrants were scapegoated in cities where suspicion replaced understanding. Even school children themselves were portrayed as vectors carriers of invisible danger. Flyers warned parents to keep dirty children at home, a phrase that mingled class prejudice with misguided attempts at prevention. Such accusations broke communities apart, deepening divisions at the very moment unity was most needed. The truth remained more complex. The real drivers of transmission were poverty crowding inadequate sanitation and the bacterium's own evolutionary advantage. Yet these realities were difficult to confront, requiring political will and social investment that many governments lacked during times of global upheaval. Still, amidst the failure and contradiction, there emerged a turning point, slow at first, then undeniable. In the 1930s and 1940s, as another war engulfed the world, researchers refined the earliest antibiotics. And when penicillin proved capable of halting streptococcal infections, the medical landscape shifted. What had once been a terror with centuries of dominance now encountered a force it could not easily evade. But before antibiotics reshaped the battlefield, scarlet fever had already left a long trail of ruin. Children lost families, fractured communities, hollowed by grief. Its history was intertwined with war, with poverty, with political inaction, and scientific struggle. The disease not only preyed upon the vulnerable, it exposed the fractures of societies unprepared for its relentless advance. And even as antibiotics began to rise, the victories that followed were neither simple nor permanent. For in the shadows of progress, the bacterium continued. As the mid-20th century advanced, the world seemed poised for a final confrontation with scarlet fever. Laboratories glowed with the promise of new medicines, while public health systems grew more structured, more modern, more confident. Cities rebuilt themselves after war, laying sewage lines, expanding hospitals, improving living conditions, changes that collectively weakened the environmental footholds on which the disease had relied for centuries. It was a period defined by optimism, but also by the quiet knowledge that the enemy had not yet been defeated. Penicillin, introduced in the 1940s, arrived like a miracle. For the first time in human history, doctors had a weapon capable not merely of easing the symptoms, but of halting the infection itself. A sore throat that once signaled fear now opened the possibility of intervention. Children who would have slipped into fever and delirium could be pulled back within days. The rash that once spread like a signal of impending devastation could be stopped before it fully bloomed. Families who had lived for generations under the shadow of scarlet fever felt a new kind of hope, tentative, fragile, but real. Hospitals transformed overnight. Wards once filled with red-faced, delirious children began to empty. Quarantined homes reopened. Schools that had shuttered during outbreaks found their classrooms full again. Across many regions, the disease that had haunted parents for centuries began to fade into memory, its presence receding so rapidly that younger physicians saw only a fraction of the cases their mentors had once confronted daily. But victory, as always, was incomplete. Antibiotics faced limitations. In some parts of the world, access was scarce, supply chains unstable, and medical infrastructure insufficient to deliver timely treatment. Rural communities, impoverished districts, and war-torn regions continued to endure what others now considered a relic of the past. In these places, scarlet fever never vanished. It merely retreated to the margins of global awareness. And as the antibiotic era expanded, a new controversy emerged. The uneasy recognition that the Streptococcus was not static. It adapted. It shifted. The very force that had nearly eradicated it applied evolutionary pressure that shaped its future. Researchers observed that not all strains responded uniformly to treatment. Some carried genetic variations that influenced virulence, toxin production, and resistance patterns. The arms race between microbe and medicine had begun. Public health experts warned against complacency. They pointed out that scarlet fever surged in cycles, rising after long, quiet periods when society believed the threat had passed. Yet their warnings often went unheeded. The disease had lost its former position in the hierarchy of fear. Other threats, polio, influenza, measles, occupied the attention of nations rebuilding after war. Scarlet fever, stripped of its former dominance, was relegated to the background of medical consciousness. This shift had consequences. Monitoring systems weakened, surveillance declined. Families forgot the signs, the strawberry tongue, the sandpaper rash, the sudden silence of a child whose throat could no longer bear the strain of speaking. Even physicians in some regions became less adept at recognizing early symptoms, their training shaped by diseases considered more urgent. Political decisions reflected this fading attention. Funding for streptococcal research waned. Laboratories turned toward other priorities. The once terrifying microbe was left to evolve in relative obscurity. Yet beneath this quiet, the bacterium continued to move. In pockets of overcrowded housing, it passed between siblings. In schools with limited access to healthcare, it spread unnoticed. In areas without antibiotics, it resumed its old patterns of devastation. Outbreaks appeared in regions still struggling with sanitation, nutrition, and access to care, reminders that the disease was as much a mirror of inequality as it was of biology. And then there were the cases that baffled physicians, children who had received antibiotics, yet developed severe complications, or communities that experienced sudden, intense outbreaks despite decades of decline. These events revealed a deeper truth. Scarlet fever had not been eliminated. It had merely been suppressed, pressured into new evolutionary directions that were not always visible until they erupted. Controversy also surrounded the role of policy. Some governments hesitated to report outbreaks, fearing that news of resurgent scarlet fever would signal weakness in their healthcare systems. Underreporting shaped public perception, creating the illusion that the disease belonged only to history. In scientific circles, debates intensified. Researchers argued over the microbe's shifting genetic landscape, over the role of viral elements that enabled toxin production, over the emerging patterns of antibiotic resistance in related streptococcal strains. The more they learned, the more they realized how little control humanity truly held. The victories of the antibiotic era were real, but precarious, a balance sustained by vigilance that was beginning to wane. Meanwhile, the psychological legacy of scarlet fever lingered. Older generations who had lived through the great epidemics carried memories of loss that shaped their worldview. They urged caution, reminded families to watch for signs, insisted that the disease could return. But their warnings often met with disbelief from younger parents who had never witnessed the terror firsthand. A gap formed between lived experience and historical reality. This was the paradox of the 20th century. Humanity had developed the tools to contain scarlet fever, yet the very success of those tools bred a complacency that threatened to unravel the progress made. It was a fragile victory, one built not on elimination, but on temporary suppression that could fail under the right conditions. And as the world entered the later decades of the century, conditions would indeed begin to shift. Population density increased. Global travel accelerated. Antibiotic use surged, often applied without caution. These forces combined in ways that would open new pathways for the disease to re-emerge, not as the overwhelming terror of previous centuries, but as a persistent, evolving reminder of what happens when humanity forgets the lessons carved into history by suffering. Scarlet fever was not finished. It had simply waited for the world to look away. As the late 20th century unfolded into the 21st, the world believed itself mostly liberated from the ancient shadow of scarlet fever. Hospitals were modern, antibiotics were abundant, childhood mortality had plummeted. In many countries, the disease had grown so rare that young physicians encountered it only in textbooks, tucked between illnesses consigned to a quieter corner of medical memory. But microbes do not vanish when forgotten. They adapt, they wait, and they return when conditions become favorable. Scarlet fever was no exception. At first, the resurgence appeared as scattered sparks, isolated outbreaks in countries long untouched by significant waves. A cluster of cases in one city, a sudden rise in another. Physicians noted that the symptoms were strangely familiar. The flushed cheeks, the coarse rash, the bright red tongue, the hoarse voice. It felt like a whisper from the past, an echo breaking through decades of confidence. Then the sparks multiplied. Regions across East Asia and Europe reported unusual increases in cases, some linked to school outbreaks where children passed the bacteria between them with ease. Laboratories examined samples and found something unsettling. Certain strains appeared more aggressive than those circulating in previous decades. The microbe had acquired new genetic elements that enhanced toxin production, making outbreaks sharper, faster, more intense. Public health officials investigated tracing the clusters with methods far more advanced than anything available to previous generations. Genomic sequencing revealed patterns of evolution, showing that even as human vigilance declined, Streptococcus pyogenes had continued its ancient work of refinement. It had reshaped itself quietly, taking advantage of antibiotic pressure, global travel, and the natural churn of microbial adaptation. The modern world provided a different landscape, but one no less vulnerable. Schools remained central hubs of transmission. Daycare centers brought infants and toddlers into close contact, creating compact networks through which illness could spread. In crowded urban neighborhoods, families still shared tight living quarters, and despite medical progress, access to care remained uneven. Antibiotics could stop the disease, but only if given quickly, only if the diagnosis was correct, only if families had the means to seek treatment. In some countries, physicians realized that parents no longer recognized the warning signs. The cultural memory of scarlet fever had faded. A red rash was dismissed as an allergy. A sore throat seemed inconsequential. A warm forehead nothing more than a passing fever. By the time medical help was sought, the toxins were already moving through the bloodstream, repeating the ancient choreography of inflammation and fever. The legacy of scarlet fever also lived on in more subtle ways. Modern epidemiology, the entire field of tracking, preventing, and responding to disease, was shaped in part by the epidemics of the 19th century. The concept of public health surveillance owes much to the fever outbreaks, that once swept through industrial cities. Quarantine systems, infection control in schools, and the structure of pediatric wards all trace their lineage to this disease. Scarlet fever helped define how societies respond to childhood illness, how data is collected, and how communities mobilize in times of infectious threat. In medicine, its influence is even deeper. Pediatric care changed fundamentally because of scarlet fever's long reign. Doctors learned to examine throats with greater precision, to study rashes with a discerning eye, to connect skin symptoms to systemic infections. The understanding of immune complications, heart damage, kidney inflammation, neurological disturbances came from decades of observing the long arc of streptococcal disease. Modern treatments for post-infectious conditions owe their existence to the children who lived through these earlier epidemics. But the legacy is not only scientific, it is also emotional. Even today, in communities where outbreaks reappear, a familiar fear returns to households, quiet, cautious, but unmistakably reminiscent of earlier centuries. Parents listen carefully to their children's voices, searching for any sign of hoarseness. They examine rashes under bright lights. They touch foreheads with the same instinctive worry passed down through generations. The disease may no longer dominate public consciousness, but the memory of its patterns remains embedded in the architecture of parental fear. In recent years, another threat has emerged: the rising concern of antibiotic resistance. Although most strains of Streptococcus pyogenes remain responsive to common treatments, scientists warn that the pressure exerted by widespread antibiotic use could one day shift the balance. Bacteria evolve not through intent but opportunity, and the modern world provides opportunity in abundance. Should resistance become widespread, the medical victories of the past century could erode reopening a door that had long seemed closed, and despite improved hygiene and medical care, outbreaks continue to surface with unsettling regularity. Some are mild, others more severe. In certain regions, the number of cases has risen sharply, reminding the world that scarlet fever remains part of the microbial landscape, not a relic, not a myth, but a present reality that demands vigilance. Beyond statistics and laboratories, the modern legacy of scarlet fever is woven into the broader narrative of humanity's relationship with disease. It reveals that even as science advances, even as societies grow more confident, the ancient vulnerabilities remain. Breath, touch, proximity, these simple acts continue to bind us to the microbial world that shares our existence. Scarlet fever, once the silent executioner of childhood, now stands as a testament to both human triumph and human fragility. It reminds us that the victories we count on are conditional, that progress can stall, that complacency has consequences, and that the line separating safety from resurgence is far thinner than modern life likes to imagine. For even in an age of advanced medicine, one truth echoes from the past: the smallest organisms often leave the largest shadows. The modern resurgence of scarlet fever forced the world to confront a paradox long buried beneath decades of medical confidence: that eradication and control are not the same thing. Control depends on vigilance, and vigilance depends on memory. When memory fades, old adversaries find room to breathe. In several regions, unexplained spikes in cases raised questions that echoed through the halls of universities and health ministries. Sequencing of bacterial samples revealed strains carrying new combinations of toxin-producing genes, arrangements not seen in earlier decades, patterns that hinted at the bacterium's restless capacity for change. While scarlet fever remained treatable with antibiotics, these genetic shifts altered its behavior. Rashes appeared sooner, symptoms escalated faster, complications emerged with renewed unpredictability. It was not the same disease that had terrorized past centuries, but it belonged to the same lineage, carrying the same ancient blueprint of invasion and inflammation. Researchers began to study these emergent strains with an intensity reminiscent of earlier epochs of scientific urgency. They examined the structure of the toxins, the mobility of genetic elements, the routes through which the bacteriophage that enabled toxin production traveled between bacterial populations. Each discovery revealed a deeper layer of complexity. The disease that once seemed conquered now appeared dynamic, adaptable, and far more intricately tied to modern conditions than anyone had expected. The 21st century also reshaped the social dimensions of scarlet fever. With global travel now routine, a localized outbreak could spread across borders in days. A child falling ill in one city could lead to cases appearing in another continent weeks later. The webs of modern connection became conduits not merely for people and goods, but for pathogens seeking new hosts. Unlike earlier centuries where outbreaks rose and fell within isolated communities, modern scarlet fever moved within a globalized landscape, one where pathogens surfed the currents of travel and trade with unprecedented speed. In some countries, the disease began to reveal itself in periods of quiet, followed by sudden surges, bursts of transmission that seemed to emerge from hidden reservoirs. Investigators noted that these cycles aligned with seasonal patterns, with the openings and closings of schools, with fluctuations in population density, and even with environmental conditions that affected human immunity. The disease no longer behaved as a simple consequence of crowding. It had woven itself into the rhythms of contemporary life. Parents, however, experienced these cycles not as scientific patterns, but as sudden intrusions. A child returns home with a sore throat. A fever rises. A rash appears. Then the voice changes, thin, hoarse, unsteady. In that moment, history collapses into the present. The disease that once filled graveyards becomes an intimate reality once again. Many parents unfamiliar with its signs turn to online forums or emergency departments in confusion. The word scarlet resurfaces in conversations with doctors, spoken with a mixture of disbelief and fear. For physicians, the diagnosis often arrives with a strange duality relief, that the illness is treatable, and unease that it has returned with such vigor. They prescribe antibiotics, monitor complications, and reassure families. But beneath their calm instructions lies an awareness inherited from earlier generations of doctors, a knowledge that the bacteria they confront today are part of a lineage that once exercised enormous power over human life. The global surveillance systems created in the wake of 20th century pandemics have become essential tools in tracking scarlet fever's modern movements. Outbreaks are mapped in real-time genomes, sequenced within days, treatment protocols refined with precision. Yet even with these advances, the disease continues to reveal blind spots in public health systems. Communities with limited healthcare access still face delayed diagnoses. Antibiotics, though effective, are not always equitably distributed. And in countries where medical misinformation spreads easily, some families hesitate to seek care at all, allowing infections to linger longer than they should. Another modern challenge lies in the rising awareness of post-infectious complications. Physicians now recognize patterns that earlier generations observed, but could not explain heart inflammation months after illness, kidney issues emerging weeks after recovery, neurological symptoms tied to immune system misfires. These conditions have become part of the broader conversation about scarlet fever's ongoing legacy, not merely an acute infection, but a potential trigger for deeper disturbances within the body. The psychological legacy persists too. Though the disease rarely kills in regions with strong healthcare infrastructure, its ability to unsettle remains powerful. For grandparents who remember earlier epidemics, each new wave stirs old memories. For parents, it sparks fresh anxieties. For children, it transforms ordinary symptoms, sore throat fever, into encounters with a disease shaped by centuries of human fear. The shadow may be lighter today, but it has not disappeared. Scarlet fever also continues to shape scientific ambition. The development of a vaccine once considered unnecessary has regained urgency. Researchers study the molecular architecture of streptococcal surface proteins, seeking a universal target that could neutralize multiple strains. Progress is slow, hindered by the bacterium's ability to vary its outer structures, but each step forward deepens understanding of a pathogen that has shaped human history more profoundly than most realize. In the broader sweep of modern life, scarlet fever stands as a reminder of a truth often overlooked: humanity's relationship with microbes is not one of domination, but negotiation. The victories of modern medicine are not final declarations, but temporary agreements maintained by vigilance, equity, and global cooperation. The tiniest gaps, overuse of antibiotics, weakened surveillance disparities in healthcare access, offer footholds for resurgence. And so despite the triumphs of the antibiotic era, scarlet fever persists in the worldwide consciousness as a symbol of fragility. It teaches that progress does not guarantee permanence, that diseases do not disappear simply because societies grow confident, that the past is never fully gone, it lingers in genomes and biology, in the breath of children who carry strains, passed down through centuries of evolution. In this way, Scarlet Fever's modern legacy is not one of defeat, but of humility. It forces humanity to confront the delicate balance between technological power and biological vulnerability, to recognize that even the smallest organisms can shape civilizations, not only in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, continuous movement of their evolution. And as the world looks forward, uncertain of what new challenges the microbial realm may hold, Scarlet Fever stands as a bridge between eras, a living memory of suffering and survival, reminding us that vigilance is not a burden, but a necessity carved into the history of every child who once lay silent beneath a fevered glow. In the long arc of human history, certain diseases become more than mere biological events. They become mirrors reflecting our vulnerabilities, our fears, our failures, and the fragile hopes that rise in the spaces between suffering. Scarlet Fever is one such mirror. It has watched humanity grow from small, scattered settlements into vast, interconnected societies. It has moved through ancient streets, medieval kingdoms, industrial cities, and the soft-lit hallways of modern hospitals. It has been both a silent shadow and a roaring terror, shaping childhood across continents and centuries. Its story is not simply a chronicle of microbes and medicine. It is a story of breath, the breath that warms the air beside a child's bed, the breath that carries illness from one throat to another, the breath that falters when fever tightens the chest. It is a story of touch hands pressed to foreheads, hands holding cups of water to parched lips, hands trembling as they search for signs of recovery. It is a story of silence, the silence that falls when a child's voice is stolen, the silence in homes marked by mourning, the silence in hospitals where hope flickers against the dim glow of exhausted lamps. Scarlet Fever has revealed again and again the delicate architecture of human life. How quickly certainty dissolves when confronted with the invisible. How deeply communities depend on one another to survive. How easily the smallest breach of sanitation, of vigilance, of memory can reopen the gates to devastation. The disease has taught that progress is never as secure as it seems, that comfort can blind societies to dangers waiting quietly at the margins of awareness. And yet within this long record of suffering lies another truth: resilience. Humanity has endured wave after wave of this ancient enemy and emerged with new knowledge, new tools, new understanding. Each outbreak left behind lessons etched into medical science and public health lessons about contagion, immunity, sanitation, and the intricate dance between microbe and host. Each generation, even in grief, contributed to a greater capacity to protect the next. But that protection is not guaranteed. Scarlet Fever reminds us that vigilance is the price of safety and memory, the shield that guards against resurgence. When societies forget the fears that shaped earlier eras, when they assume the battles won will stay won, the past seeps quietly into the present. Microbes do not rest. They adapt, they learn, they wait. This disease also exposes the profound fragility of childhood, the way a body still learning the world can be overwhelmed by forces vast in consequence, yet microscopic in form. It reveals the thin line between ordinary life and catastrophe, a line drawn not by the grand events that dominate history books, but by the quiet movements of organisms we can neither see nor feel until they have already begun their work. In the modern world, where medicine feels powerful and technology omnipresent, Scarlet Fever stands as a quiet counterpoint, a reminder that humanity's victories over disease must be tended like fragile flames, that the smallest oversight can become a spark, that the boundary between security and fear is never fixed, but shifts with every mutation, every lapse, every forgotten lesson. And so, as this story draws to a close, it offers not comfort, but clarity. The enemies humanity faces are not always dramatic, not always new, not always visible. Sometimes they are the old ones, ancient, familiar patient waiting for the moment when we believe ourselves beyond their reach. Scarlet Fever may no longer dominate newspapers or fill hospital wards as it once did, but its legacy remains woven into the fabric of public health, pediatric medicine, and the collective memory of those who lived through its worst years. It stands as a testament to the resilience of human bodies, the ingenuity of human science, and the cost of human forgetfulness. And it leaves us with one final truth, a truth whispered through centuries of fevered nights, silent sick rooms, and the quiet breath of children struggling to speak. The past is never fully gone. It waits in the shadows, patient as the smallest breath.